Hey guys, this lesson is on carbohydrates, one of the four major organic molecules. Remember, all organic molecules contain carbon, so carbohydrates contain it. They contain it in a ratio with hydrogen and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, and it's often found in a ring structure. So an example here, everyone's familiar with glucose. You have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio here, so 6 times 2 is 12, right? 6 times 1 is 6. So you have your 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, and again, it's also found in a ring structure. Okay, so if you see a structure similar to this, you know you're dealing with a carbohydrate. Going back to the ratio, I can get my lid off the marker. This would be another example of a carbohydrate, and the reason is because it's in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. This, however, would not necessarily be considered a carbohydrate because it's not in the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. This one ruins it for the whole thing. Okay, so carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, the overall purpose of a carbohydrate is to store energy. That's why your coach tells you to eat pasta before a big race, right? Or not right before, but like the night before a big race, so you have some energy stored up. Now, examples of your carbohydrates are sugars and starches. Okay, your sugars are really small, simple molecules. They burn really fast. Your starches are a lot more complex. They would be like your polymers. Remember, poly means many. Okay, so your monomers, do you remember that word? Mono means one. So the monomers build up the polymers. For carbohydrates, they have a special name, and it's called a monosaccharide. So this mono part means one, or a single, simple, and then saccharide is what we use for sugar. Okay, so a monosaccharide is a simple sugar. It's just a single simple sugar. And some examples are glucose, which we just talked about. I just showed you a picture of. Fructose and galactose. If you notice, all of them end in the same 3 letters. Those last 3 letters, ose, can indicate that you're dealing with a sugar. If you're dealing with a sugar, you're dealing with a carbohydrate. So glucose, fructose, and galactose are all examples of monosaccharides, so very simple sugars. Now you know that we don't all eat just simple sugars, they become more complex. So when we start putting these together, we start making things like disaccharides. So a disaccharide, di means 2, so you have a disaccharide, that means you're putting 2 simple sugars together. And so one example that's very common is to combine glucose with fructose. Fructose is the sugar that you find in fruit. That's why it's called fructose. But I'm going to draw this for you really quickly, maybe. So you can see what it looks like. Okay, so here we go. That's a very simple drawing. I know it looks like I'm in kindergarten, but this is glucose and this is fructose, and you can see it's bonded together. Well, this is a monosaccharide, and this is a monosaccharide, but together it makes a disaccharide. And this disaccharide, this particular one, the glucose plus the fructose, makes sucrose. And sucrose is what you put on your cereal in the morning. It's sugar, it's just table sugar. Okay, so that is an example of a disaccharide. So 2 monomers together, 2 monosaccharides together make a disaccharide. So what happens when you put 3 or more monosaccharides together? You end up with a polysaccharide. Poly means many. And so this is when you start to get into your large, complex carbohydrates. So starch, for example. Okay, starch is a complex carbohydrate. It is called a polysaccharide because it's made up of a whole bunch of monosaccharides. Glycogen is another really, really important molecule. This is how your body stores sugar in your body. It stores it in your liver, it stores it in your muscles, so that when you need sugar, it can go to that and break it down into smaller monomers, those monosaccharides. Okay, so glycogen found in the muscles of animals and in the liver. Okay, then you have another one. This is a really important one, cellulose. This is found in the cell walls of plants. It makes them very strong and sturdy. Okay, so cellulose is an extremely important molecule, and again, you can see it ends in ose, so you know it's a carbohydrate. Okay, so glycogen in animals, cellulose in plants. Two very, very important polysaccharides. Okay, so you need to know those examples. Now, I just talked about glucose, fructose, and galactose. I said that they are monosaccharides. They are monosaccharides, and what is cool is that they all have the same molecular formula. They're all C6H12O6, but they look different. Okay, but when you have molecules that all have the same molecular formula but may be arranged differently, we call them isomers. Iso means same. Okay, so again, they have the same molecular formula, but structurally they look very different. Okay, so on this next slide, you can see a picture of that. Okay, so this is glucose, and this is fructose. Okay, you notice this is a hexagon and this is a pentagon, but if you count all of the carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they have the same molecular formula, C6H12. So again, you call these isomers. Okay, and just a reminder, you know this is a carbohydrate because it is in a ring structure. You can ignore all of the letters and just try to look at the basic structure. And because it is that ring structure, you can tell it is a carbohydrate. Now, carbohydrates store energy, and remember we store energy in the bonds, but this molecule is fairly small compared to some of the other organic molecules that we're going to look at. And so for every gram of sugar that you eat, you get 4 kilocalories, or 4 big calories. So they do not store as much energy as some of the other ones that we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, but again, remember the amount of energy that is stored is determined by the number of bonds. Okay, so this is a very simple introduction to carbohydrates. I hope it was helpful.